Hello, everybody. Welcome to this special occasion with Ben Wurgraft, who is going to be talking about the future of food and the global supply chain. My name is Mina Jane, and I am one of the Cary Library programming librarians, and this kind of stuff just makes us completely happy. So welcome, and I hope you have lots of questions for Ben. I want to thank the Cary Library Foundation for helping us bring all of our programs to this library, and to you for being here. Ben is an author. He wrote Meat Planet, Artificial Flesh and the Future of Food. And he's been studying food for a long time, how, where it's been, where it's going, and how capitalism and demand and things like that affect it. He's also going to be talking about the global food supply chain because that is so on people's minds right now. So I wanted to let you know that his book is on sale at Harvard Bookstore. There's signed books available at Harvard Bookstore if you would like to purchase one. So without further ado, I'm handing it over to Ben.
Thank you so much, Mina. Now, I'd also like to say a special thank you to one member of our group this evening, which is Jennifer Webb, my childhood friend Jennifer Webb, who introduced me to the library. And I want to make sure that everybody can hear me okay. Can you hear me? Good, 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 good. I'm doing gallery view so I can see everybody. And I am hiding my own face so I can't see me. Now, as Mina said, is Artificial Flesh and the Future of Food. And it was based on 6 years of research that I did in the world. Hello, can people hear me?
We can hear you, but it's coming in and out.
Oh.
So can you turn your video off and then turn it back on again?
Yeah, let's see. How's that?
That seems better. Let's go with that.
So now I'm unmuted. I'm unmuted, and I'm free, and I'm hiding self-view for full human liberation. I think you're all now very familiar with the world of talks via Zoom. I ended up teaching via Zoom this semester at Wesleyan University where I teach, and it's obviously an entirely different world of human interaction. What I do want to say about this is that when you have questions, which I hope you will, enter them in the chat box, and I will monitor that, and we will talk about the questions that way. I think it's usually as I'm talking and there's something you want me to clarify. Speaking of the internet, the first chapter is Meat Space. And I thought that a nice way to start this evening's talk would be to do a little reading from that chapter and begin us in media res, as it were, in the world of lab-grown meat research. And after that, I will say about my research and about what lab. So beginning where the book begins, I wake up to a weird future. It's 4:30 a.m. in Los Angeles on August 5th, 2013. I'm about to watch the Food of Tomorrow appear at just past noon in London. My bleary eyes and smudged computer screen, a double set of windows into space and time. The future will arrive in the form of laboratory-grown meat made of bovine muscle cells that proliferated in a bioreactor. or at least that's how the press event that I'm awake to watch has been billed. Each announcement has been filled with promise. Meat will never be the same, nor will we. For a basic fact about humans is that one of our food sources has, for longer than we've been Homo sapiens, come from the bodies of dead animals. That might soon change as technological progress moves us further along a track that leads from hunting to farming to the laboratory. Such transitions are very serious business, and if we're perched on one of history's great pivot points, it's good to keep our sense of humor. There is something inherently silly about the idea of an international media event staged around a hamburger, one of the world's most recognizable, mundane, and American foods. At the world's fairs and expositions of a previous era, grand events that one critic called sites of pilgrimage to the commodity fetish, novel foods were displayed to crowds of visitors inside glass pavilions. I'm getting ready to watch the early 21st century equivalent, coffee mug clutched tight. Journalists have described the hamburger in question as a Frankenburger, a test tube burger, even a piece of vat meat. It was produced not by killing and butchering a cow, but through the laborious and expensive use of a well-established laboratory technique known as tissue or cell culture, first accomplished by the American embryologist Ross Harrison in 1907. After decades of use in scientific and medical research, tissue culture has only recently been used to produce what's sometimes called, with technical accuracy but zero gastronomic zest, in vitro meat. One of the many promises attached to this new meat is that it could offer an alternative to industrial animal agriculture, perhaps completely replacing its environmentally damaging and cruel practices with pacific ones. This meat's utter weirdness cannot be overstated. This would be meat that never had parents, meat that never died in the sense that a whole animal dies, and in the eyes of some critics who define their meat narrowly, never properly lived. Meat that could transform the way we think of animals, the way we relate to farmland, the way we use water, the way we think about population and our planet's carrying capacity of both human and non-human animal bodies, a new kind of flesh for a planet of omnivorous hominids who eat more meat with each passing generation. As my Los Angeles neighborhood stirs in the early morning, cyberspace becomes meat space. Clickbait stubs have swarmed through the internet in recent weeks, drawing bits of human attention, which might be the internet's real currency. I'm spending some now, by announcing the burger's shocking price tag, over $300,000 US. Rumor has it that a single wealthy benefactor in the United States has funded the Dutch laboratory that grew the cells and shaped them into muscle and then meat. Mark Post, the medical doctor and professor of physiology who created the burger, is the man of the hour, but media professionals coordinated this event, paid for by Post's benefactor. Cultured meat as a technology is still in development, despite the very established nature of tissue culture techniques. This is one of the reasons why it costs so very much to produce a small piece of meat. In the local language that we might use to describe this technology, it is still emerging, a metaphor regularly used to mark the phase when novel types of computers, energy generators, or medical technologies are devised or discovered, built or grown, eventually tested and licensed, promoted in the media with painful slowness from the perspectives of their designers and investors, and become available to consumers. Cultured meat, which is the term I tend to use, is just starting to surface as of 2013. And Post's use of the term at this event may be an effort to replace the clinical sounding term in vitro meat. The emergence metaphor makes the future sound like a kind of a mist out of which concrete things materialize. I think of the signs by which we track emerging technologies. There are patents, there are investments, there are research grants, conferences, exploratory launches of products in specific markets, splashy front page profiles of entrepreneurs in technology magazines. Before my own meat brain is properly awake, it occurs to me that the emergence metaphor performs a curious kind of sleight of hand by hiding human agency. It implies that a new technology comes toward us of its own accord, rather than being ushered into being by many hands, each pair with its own agenda. And for a given technology to really emerge, there has to be a public for it to emerge into. Someone has to be watching, and they'll have their own ideas about the future. I've been trained by utopian science fiction to expect certain things from a future of spaceships, and dystopian science fiction has taught me what to expect from a future Earth devastated by climate change. It did not, however, prepare me for a pandemic. But I do know what to expect from a future of vat-grown meat. Do I? I train my eyes on the monitor. So those are the first few pages of Meat Planet. And once again, they take place at the very start of my research in 2013. I thought it might be a little bit useful to say just a little bit about the world of cultured meat research. Cultured meat, I want to be very clear, does not exist as a consumer product as of this evening, as of this talk. You can't run out to, for example, the Star Market in Massachusetts and buy pieces of meat that were grown in a lab. And it isn't yet clear whether or not a person will be able to do that. Mina asks me, so it's not the Beyond Burger, and that's a very good prompt. So thank you, Mina. It not only is it not the Beyond Burger, it's an entirely different technology. And this is another good thing to be very clear about. There has been a lot of media attention paid to plant-based meat surrogates, chiefly the ones made by the Beyond Meat Company and by Impossible Foods. And in fact, that isn't what my book is about at all. My book is about another technology which involves tissue or cell culture, in which muscle cells taken in a biopsy from a living animal are used and placed in a growth media and encouraged to proliferate, with the idea being to produce meat by working with animal cells, rather than by doing what the plant-based burgers try to do, which is to emulate the taste and mouthfeel of meat, rather than by using animal cells. So you might say that there are two big traditions in the world of copying meat. And one of them is sensory. It's sensory mimesis or sensory copying. It involves copying the taste of meat. And the other is mimesis via biological identity, which is a fancy way of saying that the hypothesis is that something will be meat because we work with animal cells that are more or less identical to the cells that grow in the body of animals. And one of the things that I got to explore in writing a book about the world of laboratory grown meat is that, in fact, the whole idea of what meat is very much in question. And we can talk about various definitions of meat in the Q&A. It's quite interesting. A point that I got to make in the book that I think is crucial is that meat is it's a term that has a certain obviousness about it. If we say meat, we tend to think we know what we're talking about. We're talking about a piece of steak, hamburger, chicken breast, etc. We know what it is when we say the word, But in fact, the history of that word, meat, is one of shifting definitions and shifting usage back to the medieval period, when in the English language, the word meat, spelled M-E-T-E, simply meant a unit of solid food as opposed to drink. So plants were capable of being meat too in that period. So in 2013, I was lucky enough to get funded by the National Science Foundation to explore a whole new world of scientists and entrepreneurs and futurists who decided that growing cells in labs could be the future of meat. And they stated, and sincerely, that they had two main goals. And one of them was to overcome the environmental problems associated with conventional industrial meat production. And the other was to overcome the problems of animal cruelty associated with industrial meat production. And a third goal, of course, was the creation of a sustainable source of protein that could feed a growing planet of eaters who insisted on a more or less Western meat-based diet for generations to come. And the idea was that by replacing animal bodies in feedlots and slaughterhouses with cells in bioreactors, which are complicated mechanisms for growing cells in vitro, we might achieve that end. And in many ways, it's a very hopeful, very utopian position. Hoping that I've answered Mina's question and forging ahead a little bit, what I found as I did my research, which I did by making my way into laboratories, startup offices, venture capital firms, and the offices of people who do professional futures consulting on the future of food. What I discovered was that the story was much more complicated, the technology much harder, and the prognosis for a cultured meat industry further off than I was initially being told. So I found myself very surprised this week to start to see a new wave of news articles proclaiming that lab-grown meat is essentially ready. And if the US government pushed cultured meat through the regulatory apparatus that attends to any new food technology, we could be eating it relatively soon. I was astonished by that. And one thing I should say in the interests of honesty is that it's really very difficult, even for a researcher like myself who gets to spend time in that world, to really know what's happening now. And the reason for that has to do with how the research is conducted. When I began my research into lab-grown meat, much of the research was still taking place in academic laboratories. By about 2015, much of the research had shifted towards venture capital-backed startup companies that have an obligation to their shareholders or rather to their backers and eventual shareholders, to create intellectual property and to basically keep people in positions like mine from learning too much about where their level of progress really is. And this isn't to accuse them of duplicity at all. It's simply to observe that a structure of the way the industry is being created is that people like me don't always get to know what the state of the art really is. So when I see reports that the technology is sort of imminent, I get really surprised. There is, of course, the question of whether or not there's something behind the idea. And I should say that I'm not an advocate for cultured meat nor a critic of it as an idea. I'm, by training, a scholar. I was trained as a historian. I did a doctorate in history at UC Berkeley. I also work as an ethnographer. And I've been a food writer for about 20 years. But I'm not somebody who tends to approach a complicated topic like the effort to grow meat in labs with the idea that, oh, this is a great idea that we should promote, or an idea that we should roundly condemn because it seems foundationally wrong in some way. I want to understand the human stories behind it, which is a lot of what I try to explore in my book. And there are very, very good reasons to want laboratory-grown meat to work. One of them, quite simply, is that the environmental externalities of industrial-scale animal agriculture of the conventional kind are pretty bad. It may generate as much as 14% of our greenhouse gas emissions annually. It does generate a great deal of waste. It uses a lot of natural resources. If we, as a species, are going to continue to eat meat in the quantities that we do, which are dramatically large relative to the history of our species, really since the industrialization of animal agriculture, we consume far more in the way of animal products than our great-great-grandparents did. If we want to keep doing that, and do that as there are more and more of us on the planet, it would be very useful to have an alternative. And then there's the question of animal suffering. I go into this in some more depth in the book than I really can tonight, but after a lot of reading and thinking and discussion with people involved in the philosophy of animal life and our moral commitments to non-human animals, I really am of the conviction that there isn't a very strong defense of the practice of consuming animals via cheap meat, via industrial scale, comparatively inexpensive meat for our pleasure. There just isn't a good defense of it, since it costs the animals far more than it gives us. However, I want you to know that I'm an omnivore and somebody who consumes meat himself. And I consider this to be one of the many ways in which my life is morally imperfect, like most of our lives. And it's something that I mostly decide to live with, but wish could be different. And that's the spirit in which I engaged with the sort of very morally charged proposition of cultured meat as I researched this book. Now, so I share a lot in the way of beliefs with many of the people who want to make cultured meat a reality. As I came to do field work among the people in the world of cultured meat, I also came to see that there are things that we didn't agree on. And one of those things was the claim that the story of technology is by and large a story of progress that's basically positive. It is positive in many respects, but it isn't always so. Or that the idea that I found among many of them, that there was this odd way in which the history of our species was one of technological and moral progress. These things almost march together. So as I did my research, I started to find that this wasn't just a story about food, about what people considered to be a good diet, about why people thought that meat should be a part of our diet, and that it was more plausible to grow meat in a lab than to simply stop eating it. I found that it was actually a book about philosophical questions, having to do with what human beings are as creatures that eat other creatures, as creatures that have taboos against eating our own species, as creatures who tend to think about the future and tend to like to imagine that there are things we can do to influence it. So much of the book explores those questions. I found today, I very rarely visit Amazon.com, but I was curious what category Amazon had put my book in. And I found that my book is actually considered, hamburger and sandwich recipes category on Amazon.com. And for those who are interested in learning more about laboratory-grown meat, my book won't teach you how to cook it, because my book won't tell you that it's going to be available soon. It's just not a claim I felt comfortable making. Now, I see that we've already gone a half hour into our program, and there was something else that I felt moved to write today that I'd like to share with you. And it relates to cultured meat in a very direct way. To say the obvious for the sake of saying it, we're gathered here via Zoom because of a pandemic. And that pandemic has affected everything about our lives. And it's affected our food supply in different ways. And one of the things that I started to observe over the last few months was that there were horror stories rolling in from the world of meat production in this country. Stories that had a great deal to do with human health, with the way in which people who work in the meat industry, who are typically doing very, very, very dirty and health detrimental and injury promoting jobs, ended up suffering disproportionately from the coronavirus. And this has had a set of effects on the meat supply chain. And I, at the same time, was starting to see from the world of cultured meat a set of messages about how this was a sign that, in fact, it was time to promote cultured meat again and time to shut down conventional meat altogether. And there's something about this that really troubled me. And I ended up taking it upon myself to write about this. I'm just going to do a little bit of stage management here to create a little light for myself. And because my document is on the computer, I'm going to bring it up here so that I can read. This is a very short piece, and I won't say too much about it. I'll just read to you. It's called Culled, C-U-L-L-E-D. The farmers I read about don't want to cull their herds. They don't want to kill 30,000 animals in a single day. Every animal has a purpose, one farmer says in an interview for the New York Times. Every being has a purpose. We've raised these pigs to go into the food supply, and now so many are being wasted. The farmers simply have nowhere to send their animals. The slaughterhouses and meatpacking plants are struggling. The animals are gaining weight rapidly, and soon they'll be too large for a plant to process. These are problems, I should say, that I've never observed firsthand. But such is the nature of eating food for most of us denizens of the cities living far from farms. It's now June 18th, and here in the United States, we're several months into the COVID-19 pandemic. I don't go out very much. I'm not doing ethnographic research in the world of cultured meat production or any other world, although like many of us, I've been paying attention to the news. First to the constant stream of pandemic news, and for the past few weeks to the news about the protests in the name of George Floyd and other Black Americans who've been killed by police. Vulnerability is everywhere, and even though it's universal, it's not evenly distributed. The pandemic has made us painfully aware of structural problems in our lives. Today, inequality wears the face of wealthy New Yorkers escaping to the Hamptons and even planning a private school campus there for their children. We see inequalities in what businesses may close, which of us lose our livelihoods or our lives. It's odd to see what receives financial and moral support from the government. On April 28th, President Trump stated, and forgive me, I'm quoting him right now, "It is important that processors of beef, pork, and poultry, meat and poultry, in the food supply chain continue operating and fulfilling orders to ensure a continued supply of protein for Americans." This statement was part of an executive order too toothless to actually chew anything. But some reporters saw it as a command to reopen meatpacking plants run by companies like Tyson and Smithfield. Many of those plants had to close because of very widespread cases of COVID-19 among workers who operate the lines literally shoulder to shoulder. These workers often live in tiny, remote towns and have few work options with which to support their families. There may have been, by some reports, as many as 20,000 cases of COVID-19 in US meatpacking plants so far. Nor is the problem limited to the US. Plants in Germany and Wales are seeing cases. Meat prices in supermarkets have risen as a result of diminished supply because meat producers have greatly consolidated their meatpacking operations in recent decades. Closing a single plant can have a huge effect on the supply of, for example, pork products, causing a drop of as much as 5% of available supply. Over a month ago, the CEO of Tyson Foods, the biggest meat producer in the US and one of the 4 biggest meat companies on the planet, took out a newspaper ad in the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Arkansas Democrat Gazette, in which he wrote, "The food supply is breaking." Tyson helped to create the system that very system over the past 40 years by buying out its competitors and consolidating production in larger and larger plants, the same plants that are now shutting down. There might be something funny about a president naming meat an essential industry. That is, if the sadness of culling animals weren't itself so touching. Funny, I mean, because of its obviousness. Meat has, for a long time, been a measure of dietary plenty, going back to times when having a chicken in every pot really meant prosperity, or back before the industrialization of meat, when eating meat several times a week took wealth. Making cheap meat by industrial means is an impressive feat, but consolidating production has made the system fragile. As cracks appear, you can look through them and see people and the animals they raise. And I think you can also see something else. You can see the weird linked assumptions that meat is so essential to our flourishing, and that a healthy society is one in which everyone can have as much meat as they want. Meat doesn't just tell a story about human and animal lives, but about the stories we tell ourselves about our shared security and prosperity. If those stories depend on cheap meat, that's like resting the collective well-being of millions of us omnivores on a house of cards. Now, I'm not writing this with the background thought that cultured meat is going to arrive and fix everything. Indeed, I'm frustrated when I hear pundits tell us that the arrival of cultured meat products will repair what's broken in our food system. For the years of my research, I heard daily about how terrible meat processing plants are, about how much of our pollution they create, about how cruel they are to the animals who suffer and die in them. And I don't want to write in their defense, I never would. But pundits who write that now is the time to let conventional meat die and to champion laboratory-grown meat can't help but seem opportunistic to me, and perhaps to be writing in bad taste. We're still in a crisis of devastating proportions, a crisis that's social, political, and economic, seemingly the worst since 1929. To claim the moral high ground at this moment seems to me wrong, and sympathy seems really precious. And I don't mean sympathy for the big companies, but sympathy for the people who keep getting squeezed by the structures of monopoly capitalism, which is the structure of cheap meat. We may also need sympathy for ourselves, since our successful recovery may depend on our ability to get creative when it comes to our food choices, to eat weirder meat or simply less meat than we have before. Thank you for listening to that too. If you'd like to hear more about some of those themes and developments, I would really like to recommend an episode of one of my favorite radio programs, which is Good Food, hosted by Evan Kleiman out of KCRW in Los Angeles. They did an episode on May 9th focused on the meat crisis, and there's a wonderful interview with Christopher Leonard, author of the 2014 book Meat Racket. So Thank you so much for listening. And we can certainly, yeah, I can type that for everybody. It's good food, and it's hosted by Evan Kleiman. She's really wonderful. And I'm going to say just a little bit more and then start to segue into a gratifyingly long and luxurious Q&A session. And I want to say a little bit about hope and skepticism about laboratory grown meat. Again, I'm hopeful about it because I really think that there should be a better alternative to the meat system that we currently have saddled ourselves with. And I'm skeptical, on the other hand, because the technical problems that I've seen in regards to cultured meat production don't seem, or didn't seem when I finished my research in 2018, 2019, to be ending. Those technical problems were multiplex. And one of them was that to grow cells in a laboratory environment, you really need to feed them with some form of growth media. And the most effective growth media available and that was cheap enough to use at scale contained something called FBS, or fetal bovine serum, whose origins, as you can tell from the name, fetal bovine serum, were far from vegan, right? So they involved the death of animals. There has been, since 2013, a kind of a race to find a way around that problem, either by finding a way around growth media or by finding a way to find essentially a vegan but cost-effective surrogate for FBS. The other problem has to do with the dimensionality of meat tissue. The first piece of laboratory-grown meat consumed in a kind of tasting environment with the idea of ultimately producing food was a hamburger. It's the hamburger I was describing in my opening reading. It was created by the laboratory of Mark Post at Maastricht University. And one of the reasons that they made a hamburger was that they had to target a version of meat that they could create by growing cells more or less on flat planes inside tea flasks in a lab, and then form into strands of muscle, and then form that into a kind of a loose slurry that could be molded into a patty. They could have made sausage just as easily. And the reason for this is that mammalian cells don't like to live too far from nutrient sources. I believe it's about 200 micrometers, or the width of the thickest human hairs. That is the distance that they like to live. It's called the maximum distance they like to live, excuse me. It's called the blood diffusion limit. So if you want to grow cells in a more or less three-dimensional configuration, you need some form of vascularized environment for them to grow in. And what I mean is that they need to have a form that mimics the capillaries and veins and arteries of a body. And without that, you can't achieve complex forms of meat that require arrangements of sheets of muscle and interleaving fat that you might see in, for example, a beefsteak. Without three-dimensionality, no forms of meat that depend on arrangements of parts of muscle and fat to achieve texture. So if the goal is to perfectly copy and emulate meat as it occurs in animals, the technical requirements are high. And we're not even talking yet about the problem of scale, of producing these things in the quantities that it would take to be fully competitive with conventional meat production, including at price point. Because we don't expect people to be buying $40 hamburgers at McDonald's out of their beneficence vis-a-vis cows. It's not an outcome anybody expects. So these have been the main technical hurdles, certainly not the only technical hurdles. And it has been difficult at times to have conversations in public life around cultured meat that deal with all of these issues in a more or less open way. There's a professional futurist, somebody in the consulting world named Peter Schwartz, who has a lovely term to describe what's happened. He has this term called official future. And according to Peter Schwartz, what official future means is that a group of people have decided that for their particular interest group, there is a very specific vision of what the future has to look like. And that means that in public messaging around their goals, they really like to stay, I suppose the term now would be on brand. And on brand for laboratory grown meat usually is, we are quickly making our way past the technical hurdles and this will be available soon. And I've found a diminishing number of conversation partners in the conversation around lab-grown meat who want to talk about the problems too, which makes that conversation all the more precious. I always like to give a shout out to one of the best sources of information about cultured meat and cellular agriculture more generally, which is the replacement of animal products with laboratory grown analogs that draw on animal cells usually. And one organization that does really wonderful work around this and is a great clearinghouse for information is New Harvest, led by Isha Datar. And I've worked closely with them in conversation for years. I love their work. I love their interest in questions. Now, just going to address myself to Mina for a moment. I see that we actually have some questions that are starting to crop up, which is wonderful. And I wonder if this might not be a good time to shift towards Q&A. I've been rattling on at you guys for a little bit now this evening.
I think that's a great idea. I think that's a great idea. And I was also going to tell people, I just wrote it down, that people can start turning their videos on if they would like to, because I know you would like to see people as you're chatting with them.
I would. I want to see your smiling faces. Or your disgusted faces. If you're completely grossed out by the idea of growing meat in a lab, I want to hear about that too. So Lee Harris asks a question.
Sorry, I was Lee Harrison, not
Lee Harris. I wrote
right.
that wrong.
Yes, no, of course. Lee, I'm so sorry. So Lee Harrison asks, what made you ultimately decide that this was absolutely the project for you to devote a number of years to? Where is the place that it took you that you weren't at all expecting at the outset? And does this book have any similarities to your next book project, or is it too early to tell? Oh, it's the writing question. It's the question, the kinds of books that I write, this is my third book, the kinds of books that I write typically take, 3 to 10 years. They don't take 6 months to 2 years. They're an investment of research time and of human time, of mortal time. And I wrote Meat Planet because it was weird enough to promise really interesting ethnography. The people involved with this research, I surmised, would be interesting people. And they would have visions of the future that I could write about. They were working on a food product that would allow me, as somebody who is trained both in the history of philosophy as an academic and experienced as a writer about food, to write about both, to use a topic in food to convene readers around a set of social and philosophical questions that I thought were really weighty and involved drawing on some of the philosophers I've written about in previous work. So that's how it connected to my past as a scholar and writer. And I have no idea what I'm going to write next. I have a book that I'm finishing. I have the very good fortune. I have a unique circumstance, which is that I'm co-authoring a book in food history with my mother, who's a food anthropologist. My mother is named Mary White, and she teaches in Japanese studies at Boston University, and she's a food anthropologist. And she and I are writing a short book about food together. But after that, I have no idea, and I like not knowing. I find it bracingly honest to say that I don't know what I'm going to do next until I really am sure. So thank you so much for the question. I see that Jean Williams asks, doesn't the fact that many human diseases originate in animals and can be transferred to humans suggest that people shouldn't have close associations with animals? Well, it's interesting. I mean, certainly there are ways and ways. And when you say close associations with animals, we can ask what exactly the content of that phrase is. What does that mean? It's certainly true that feedlots can be breeding grounds for various pathogens that can jump the animal to human barrier. And this in and of itself is an argument against greatly concentrated levels of industrial animal agriculture. I think that's absolutely true. I don't think that, I think that it's one of many, many arguments that you could say are arguments for shutting the whole thing down. And there aren't very many, I think, good arguments for keeping, as I'm saying very casually and sloppily, the whole thing going. When you say sort of close associations with animals, I'm not aware that having pets is a major problem in terms of the transmission of illness to humans, but I may also be underinformed about that, not being a scholar of pets.
Jean actually wrote, she means in the sense of farming them, cleaning up after them, keeping them enclosed and killing them.
Well, this seems like a good moment to advertise my lack of absolute authority here, given that it isn't something that I delved into deeply, but what I did read about it suggests to me that it's by and large a question of concentration and scale of operation, rather than absolute practice, in the sense of, if somebody is somewhere keeping a cow, are we safe, right? Dave Humbird asks, is it easier to criticize capitalism than cultured meat? Well, so I could be flippant and say they're equally easy to criticize, but I think it's a question that deserves a deeper kind of meditation, because my book, in a certain sense, criticizes both capitalism and cultured meat. It doesn't say, hey, capitalism's a bad thing and this is how we should organize our economy differently, in part because that's just not the kind of thinker and writer I am. But I do tend to think that meat is a problem, but it's also the iceberg tip of a deeper problem. And that deeper problem is scale. And that deeper problem is the scale at which we live. That problem of scale has, in recent decades and even centuries, been very much mediated by market capitalism and by the principle of growth, and the idea that markets and economies should display growth, and that populations too can be healthy in a state of growth and good for markets in a state of growth. But I want to say that there's a famous argument from Thomas Robert Malthus in 1798 that population tends to outstrip improvements in our food supply. And this means that the poorest among us will always be exposed to hunger and want. And this gives us that adjective Malthusian, and the idea that there are these people, Malthusians, who are gloomily predicting doom. And it wasn't just proponents of free market capitalism who criticized Malthus and said, no, technological improvement can lift us out of that. Socialists did too. Marx and Engels did too. So there have been many socialist prophets of technological progress as well as capitalist ones. And it's not an easy situation in which ideas about technology always map onto one position on market economics or another. The story is more complex than that. To Dave's question again, I think it would be sloppy of me to criticize cultured meat as a proxy for criticizing capitalism, because they exist in complex relation with one another. But I'm certainly willing to criticize both. I just would like to do it in a somewhat disambiguated way. Is that okay? Answer? Is that satisfactory?
I think that's great.
So Alice Boone asks a question, and I'm just going to read it. I want to read the questions. With every news story in popular science and medicine coverage, we now all want to be experts in vaccine testing, manufacture, and distribution. How has your study of speculative research and competitive laboratories let you reconsider about our appetites for these stories of hope, anxiety about a pandemic solution? Oh, Alice, thank you. I don't know the answer, but I'm very happy to speculate with you. The word that I use often in Meat Planet is promise and promising. There's a whole chapter called Promise. And I end up saying that the way the whole system functions is via promises, that it takes a promise of future technological accomplishment to generate an investment in the company. It takes promises about the potential, the future potential of the technology to get people to believe in it. So in a certain way, it takes promises to make the system that we're living in run. On the other hand, promises sometimes don't pan out, often don't pan out in all areas of our lives. Promises in a much more general sense mediate our relationship with the future. I promise I'll bring you some takeout tomorrow. I promise I'll wear a mask. You know, I promise I will stay 6 feet away from you when we gather on your porch for a drink. These things may or may not be true. We trust one another that they will be. Some of them are very easy to keep. Staying 6 feet away from you on your porch is very easy. Promising you that lab-grown meat will undercut the market for conventional meat in a space of 3 to 5 years, that's much harder to keep. So this is what I'm getting at. And I think the way it bears on Alice's question may be pretty transparent, but just to try to spell it out. My own opinion about the current effort to generate predictions about a vaccine for COVID-19 as you know, one version of coronavirus is that they do bear some relationship to research and manufacture in virology and vaccine testing and production. But they also have an important social function, which is to speak to the question that must be somehow in us, maybe subconsciously, all the time, every day now, which is how long? How long are we going to do what we're doing? And it relates in complicated ways to the sequence of efforts to reopen the economy in advance of a vaccine. In advance of a vaccine, in advance of really widespread testing in many countries, including this one, and seemingly in the interests of those with the greatest to gain from reopening our economy. and with the people bearing the brunt, and I tried to get at this with the short piece that I read today called, with people bearing the brunt, or the people who most badly need to go back to human contact jobs in order to keep a roof over their head and feed themselves and their families. So that's really what I'm trying to get at in response to this question about stories of hope, about pandemic solutions. Fen Yu Liao has asked two questions, and one of them is, have you consumed cultured meat? And the other is, how possible would the mass production of cultured meat make global warming worse? To what degree is it possible that this would make it all worse? I have not eaten cultured meat. I've absolutely not eaten cultured meat. And I'm actually interested in talking about that for just a second. The reason I haven't eaten cultured meat is partly because so very little of it has been made, in fact. So very little of it has actually been produced that they don't waste it on visiting anthropologists, by and large. They may give some to journalists who seem very likely to write promotional materials for them, which hasn't been the case for me. I think I've seemed like somebody who wasn't likely to write promotional materials, for better or worse. And what they tell me is that it tastes like cultured chicken. So that's my dumb joke. The first question, though, is it possible that it would make global warming worse? Yes, it's absolutely possible. How can you do a life cycle assessment of something for which we don't have factories? How can you do an analysis of something like the environmental impact of cultured meat when it doesn't really exist? Well, there's actually an answer to that question, and that people do what are essentially speculative life cycle analyses of it. And some people, bold, enterprising, really smart people, do studies that are sort of based on inputs and outputs of ingredients to see what the cost of this in terms of raw materials would likely be, because to create something like cultured meat involves things like sugar, potentially in large quantities. The story is unknown. Hannah Tuomisto, who then was a graduate student at Oxford, did an early life cycle assessment in 2011, which a number of people, including Hannah, later criticized and shot full of holes and replaced with other life cycle assessments. And a number of teams have done them, some of which seem to suggest that for given meat types, and thus animal species types, and for given volumes, different kinds of cultured meat would or would not be environmentally superior to what we have now. But yeah, it's a very difficult question to answer, but a wonderful one to ask. So I'm open to other questions. Thank you so much for these.
So I don't see any other questions in the chat, but people are welcome to continue to ruminate on and ask a couple.
I see there is one other question that just appeared, so I'm going to turn to that in a second. But I'm curious to ask the group a question. If I can I do that, Mina? Is that cool?
Yeah, absolutely.
So my question is, what is meat? And I ask that question, I like to ask that question at every talk I give, to ask what people think. And so the question is, what is meat? And what I would love is if somebody is willing to step forward and offer a kind of casual definition of meat, like the way you might define meat in your everyday life.
People can feel free to unmute themselves to give an answer as well. Elaine?
Well, first of all, as far as turning your video on, I get an error message that you've turned us off. So maybe you have to turn us on. But I don't really have a definition of meat. I've been listening to this and thinking that I'd rather not eat meat. Unless, like,
Yeah.
this doesn't sound very appetizing to eat in vitro meat or lab-grown meat.
Is it less appetizing than the thought of industrially produced meat?
Well, that's the thing. I never think about that much, you know.
Yeah. I can see that my light is getting dimmer here, which is great. It's increasingly atmospheric. So
I'd like to comment really quick too about that question, Ben, is that I'm Indian, and even in India, like, they have different levels of what people consider meat. So, like, you know, you would think it's a religious thing, but there's certain certain religions that don't consider chicken to be meat. Or in this country, people don't think of fish as meat. So it's interesting to me that you asked that question, because people do have different definitions.
Well, I stayed with a Hindu family in New Delhi who told me that their meat rules were different on Tuesdays. There was a day of the week, because of their family relationship with the monkey god Hanuman, that it was different. That it was at that level of granularity for them anyway. But you're voicing something that I definitely heard from many people in my research. Many of them Indian, actually, but also people from different parts of the world have very different senses of what meat is. And one of the things that I've been really interested to see is whether or not people interested. It's a very international world now, cultured meat production. And I was interested to see whether or not definitions of meat and types of targets for meat production would be different from place to place. So I may be getting this wrong, but I believe there's a company in Singapore called Shiok Meats, which comes from the Singaporean expression, damn shiok, it's really good. And I think they're trying to create shrimp. I think they're working with shrimp cells with the idea that they might produce something like a shrimp dumpling. And I think that this is truly interesting. Now, earlier in the chat, somebody mentioned a 2014 book called the In Vitro Meat Cookbook, which I know there are some people on this call who are actually return customers to my talks. Thank you so much for being here. I like to talk about the In Vitro Meat Cookbook all the time. It was a wacky art project created in the Netherlands by a team of designers who are speculating about what the future of meat might be like if meat doesn't have to be conventional cuts of meat that come from animals. And what was so exciting about that was the idea that cultured meat might actually be a technology for shifting our definitions of meat. I do want to go to since Christina's been very patient about her question. Christina's asked in the comments, I see this race to lab-produced meat as cognate with the race to populate and terraform Mars. Your consideration of the problem and history of meat in relation to those things that make us human seem also tied to our exhaustion of this planet, even as technology would see these advancements along frontiers as signs of progress. I may be butchering this question a little bit, but I think that this question, correct me if I'm wrong, is about how anthropocentric our technology is, and about whether or not the technology that we're trying to create is about being increasingly the masters of our universe, having fewer and fewer forces that lie outside of our control. And that's a very broad, sort of a broad, you might say, cultural idea, I suppose. Well, in 2000, there was a team at Truro College in New York, run by a scientist named Benjamin that tried to culture goldfish cells. And the idea of culturing goldfish cells was going to be to create a food source, protein source for long distance space flights. And they had a research grant from NASA at one point supporting their research. And I thought that this was kind of fascinating because it suggests that cultured meat might be on some level tied to the history of people trying to think about food for constrained environments. And spaceflight might be such an example of a constrained environment, but so might Spaceship Earth, if that makes sense. So thank you so much. You know, Dave points out that Catholics don't necessarily consider seafood to be meat. That's absolutely true. The question of whether or not fish is meat is a live one. And Lee writes again that one thing I find interesting is that many people, even the vegetarians among my nearest and dearest, understand fish as meat, but don't also will allow themselves to eat it. I mean, one thing that's certainly true and that researching people's food practices will remind you of is that we are not consistent creatures, you know, in terms of our food choices. Consistency is not something that most of us offer very much of. Some people who talk about cultured meat and some people who are pundits on its behalf really like the notion that it might be a way to remove choice from the food system so that more of us don't make what they see as the wrong choice. Now I see a question that's coming up, and I think this is. I probably have time for a couple more.
Yeah.
Can cultured meat be kosher? That's a softball question. That's a softball question because there's a chapter of my book called Kosher. There's a chapter of the book that's all about whether or not laboratory grown meat might be kosher, and I'm going to start to read it to you. I'm going to read you the first paragraph of it by way of answer. Jews have been asking if artificial flesh might be kosher for a very long time. The question even appears in the Talmud, the collection of rabbinic commentary on the Hebrew Bible. In Talmudic tractate Sanhedrin 65b, two rabbis, one of them named Chanina and the other named Oshaya, spend every Sabbath evening studying the Kabbalistic book of creation, the Sefer Yetzirah. They use its teachings to create a calf, which they then eat without slaughtering it in accordance with kashrut or kosher law. Despite this transgression, interpreters of the tractate have had reason to wonder whether Chanina or Oshaya actually violated kashrut. The man-made calf may not have been a real animal, at least according to Rabbi Yeshaya Halevi Horowitz, who was active during the late 16th through the early 17th century. Its unnatural status meant that shechita, or the practice of kosher slaughter, might have been unnecessary. But other authorities, though they agreed that the calf was unnatural, opined that the failure to perform shechita violated a different principle, that of marit ayin, the avoidance of actions that might appear improper, even though they're not actually improper. Thus, even an artificial calf would have to be slaughtered appropriately, lest Chanina and Oshaya appear to hold themselves above the law, consuming a seemingly natural but unkosher, because not properly slaughtered, calf. This is a story about keeping up appearances, but also about the treatment of animals and its relationship between meat and the cycle of animal life. I'll read a little bit more because I'm having fun and I'm indulging myself. In another Talmudic narrative, Tractate Sanhedrin 59b, a different kind of artificial flesh appears. A traveling rabbi who is threatened by lions on the road prays to the heavens and receives an immediate answer. Two hunks of flesh fall from the sky to distract his assailants. Obligingly, The lion sees one hunk, leaving the rabbi free to carry the other to the study hall. There, the piece of meat feeds a different kind of hunger, a hunger for debate. The final judgment is that no unfit thing, so no unkosher thing, descends from heaven. The meat is not only good for the Jews, but it fuels both the body and the mind. This story, like that of Chanina and Oshaya, invites us to wonder where miraculous or magical meat might fit in the order of nature. What mental operations are needed to place a new form of meat in our picture of the world and within the regulatory system that governs our eating? Thank you. The answer is some people say yes, some people say no. And my prediction regarding kosher regulators is that that's going to continue to be the story even when cultured meat exists. So thank you guys so much. It's been really fun to share the evening with you, and I'd like to invite more questions before we have to shut things down for the evening.
We actually have some interesting comments. In Chinese-speaking cultures, China, Singapore, etc., the word meat and flesh are the same word. I had no idea. And Dave says, not even all amino acids can be made kosher, not economically anyway.
Yes. No, it's true. One way to talk about the story of both of kosher law and of halal ordinances is that different religious traditions have had to respond to the industrialization of our foodways in different ways. And sometimes that means, for example, rabbis debating whether or not a particular product derived originally from part of a pig, but so transformed in the course of its production that it bears no resemblance to the original material, counts as deriving from a pig and thus being unkosher at the point of human use. So it's really a kind of anthropologically rich and wonderful world of thinking about what we consider to be pure and what we consider to be unclean. And it seems likely that if our food technology changes, our sense of what is clean and unclean, going back to that question about whether or not laboratory grown meat is gross or not, really, is disgusting or not, that these questions are going to continue to come up.
Well, thank you so much, Ben. This has been fascinating, absolutely fascinating. I thank everybody who came and asked questions and listened to the whole, this whole interesting conversation. And you can find Meat Planet at any indie bookstore or Harvard bookstore if you wanted a signed copy. So again, thank you so much, Ben. This is really amazing.
Thank you so much, Mina, and thank you all. Everybody stay safe. I wish you a really healthy summer.
Thank you.